Global procurement operates across hundreds of overlapping tax jurisdictions, which creates a systemic vulnerability for any standard procure-to-pay pipeline. The moment a supplier manually enters a tax rate into a network portal, they introduce unverified data into the transaction stream. If an enterprise accepts that supplier-generated figure without internal verification, they internalize the supplier's calculation errors, creating immediate audit liabilities. SAP Ariba guards against this liability using a structural defense mechanism that isolates tax calculations. Ariba operates on an invoice-only validation model. It restricts tax evaluation entirely to the invoice phase of the pipeline. This means the upstream documents, the requisitions and purchase orders, are generated as tax null files. Removing tax estimates early in the process ensures that purchasing phases aren't delayed by complex iterative tax approvals before an order can even be placed. By deferring all tax handling, the system trades upstream operational friction for a mathematically sound compliance check downstream. When the supplier receives that tax null purchase order via the Ariba network, they review the baseline items. They then execute a standard PO flip, converting that purchase order directly into an actionable invoice document. At this stage, the supplier is required to input whatever tax amounts they deem appropriate for the transaction. The Ariba network portal is built without logic gates or calculation validations at this specific entry node. When the supplier hits submit, the network performs no tax validation. If that unverified data packet flows straight into the enterprise ERP system, any discrepancy becomes a compliance violation. Because the external gateway accepts supplier input, the enterprise's internal reconciliation engine serves as the sole line of defense. To see how that defense works, we have to look past the supplier's external submission and examine the enterprise's internal processing environment. This process flow diagram maps the internal reconciliation architecture. Notice the initial steps on the far left. The requisition and purchase order generation bypass any tax calculation gates. The transaction's path clears the receipt phase and drops into the main invoice processing column. Once the invoice reconciliation document is created, the ingested invoice hits a series of central decision gates. If the system detects an anomaly, the workflow halts here, at the node where an invoice exception is created. The overall flowchart is sprawling, but the operational reality comes down to the specific math executed inside that single exception node. To master this architecture, we have to deconstruct how the internal calculation intersects with the supplier's unvalidated data at this juncture. SAP Ariba Buying and Invoicing handles this intersection by running an independent counter-calculation. It processes two distinct streams, the incoming supplier invoice data and the enterprise's internal tax table engine, which serves as the mathematical ground truth. To generate that ground truth, the tax table stream requires three variables from the invoice. The first variable is the commodity code, such as code 40 for office supplies. Next, it requires the spatial variables defining the jurisdiction, the exact ship from and ship to locations. The system runs these three variables against the preloaded customer tax tables to output a discrete tax code and its corresponding tax rate. Mathematically, this rate translates into the expected tax amount for the transaction. This deterministic matrix removes human guesswork, providing a strict internal baseline for the reconciliation process. With that baseline established, the system initiates the actual reconciliation. Now, it directly compares the unvalidated tax amount submitted by the supplier against the system's expected tax amount. When those two numbers fail to align, the protocol is rigid. The system generates a discrete flag, categorized as an overtax, undertax, or PO tax exception. This flag quarantines the transaction, freezing the invoice in place before it can be transmitted to the ERP. At this point, the automation pauses. A human tax manager must step in to review the quarantined invoice. The manager has two clear options: resolve the discrepancy using internal tax knowledge, or reject the invoice straight back to the supplier for correction. The system is not designed to automatically fix the supplier's mistake. It is designed to isolate that mistake for human compliance review. Scaling this logic from a single transaction to a global deployment requires examining the system configuration level. This entire architecture relies on the accuracy, depth, and maintenance of the customer's tax tables. The first structural choice during implementation centers on the primary tax calculation engine. Using Ariba's built-in engine offers rapid deployment and incurs no additional licensing costs. It is effective for small to medium businesses or entities operating within a limited number of tax jurisdictions. But as an enterprise scales into complex, multinational tax scenarios, the native engine reaches its functional limits. At that operational threshold, integrating an external tax engine becomes necessary to maintain compliance. Selecting an underpowered engine during the initial build limits the enterprise's ability to scale globally without creating manual bottlenecks. The final challenge involves how the enterprise manages continuous global tax rate fluctuations. Relying on manual tax rate maintenance generates operational overhead and increases the probability of human data entry error. The architectural recommendation is to deploy fully automated tax rate updates. This is achieved by utilizing Ariba's standard integrations to pull from specialized external tax rate databases. This allows critical compliance data to flow directly into the system, updating the mathematical logic silently in the background. This constant synchronization eliminates the manual bottlenecks that would otherwise slow the tax management team. An efficient procure-to-pay architecture does not waste cycles trying to force suppliers to enter perfect tax data at the source. Instead, it deploys a deterministic automated reconciliation net. It catches calculation errors silently and elevates only genuine compliance risks to human managers.